All right, Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of the Young Adult Project Management and Career Coaching Program. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to start with a quick review of what we covered the last couple of days. So on day 1, as you probably recall, we started talking about what a project is, right? So we mentioned common attributes of projects. I'm going to try to get the slide here. We talked about how projects are temporary pieces of work that have very confined start and dates, and they also focus on delivering some unique value, something that is, novel. It has a lot of risk inherent in it. It's a little bit ambiguous. We talked about common characteristics across projects. We gave examples of projects. We mentioned all these things. We also we talked about common characteristics, that there's a team behind the scenes, there's some limited resources, there are risks, and it requires planning, communication. It requires the ability to execute work and the ability to control and monitor that work that's being executed, compare it to your plans to see how close or far you are from your goals. Then we jumped into some general concepts about management. We talked about the 4 key cornerstones of management: planning, organizing, directing, and control, and how that those are also common with project management. The only difference is project management also includes 2 process groups, what we call initiation and closing. So we spent some time talking about that, this chart here. Then we went to the concept of a life cycle of a project, that projects have initial phases, or phase 1, 2, 3. These phases could be broken down depending on what makes best sense for the business or the objective of the project. In cases, for example, of IT upgrades, if you're doing an upgrade across an organization, let's say 10,000 employees, you might decide to do it in 5 stages, 2,000 each, or you tackle certain regions first and then others later, and so on. But within each phase or stage, we discussed that you deal with it as if it's a project in its own. It could have its own initiation and its own closing, with everything in between. We also discussed how the level of risk drops as you move on with your project work, as you can see in this dotted line. And that's because projects are progressive, meaning you learn more as you do more work and you get more clarity into things. And then we jumped into, after talking about the 5 process groups that are up here, we talked about the different knowledge areas. We mentioned scope management, integration management. We talked a little bit about schedule and time management, and then cost management. Today, we'll continue our discussion talking about quality management, resource management, communications, risk, procurement, and stakeholders. A little blurb on leadership. And then we'll close with agile project management, how, it's slightly a different approach than waterfall. So when you look at this diagram here, we see there's a concept phase, a design phase, implementation, deployment, disposal. People refer to this as waterfall, meaning, one phase falls after another. This used to be extremely common. It's still very common, especially in large scale projects. You're talking a 10-year project to build, for example, a large power plant, right? Or to construct a highway between 2 cities, or across 2 different counties. The world is moving more towards shorter time periods, because what people have realized is that with projects that extend over long periods of time, teams change and technologies change and things, move very rapidly nowadays. And by the time you complete your first phase, your requirements might have changed. You've spent a lot of money, and to adjust, it's really difficult. So the whole concept and idea of agile is to be quick and able to address changes quicker than later, with more flexibility. So we'll talk more about that towards the end of the day. And then we'll close with the coaching component, how that's going to work, how we're going to work together for those 8 weeks, and gain some value from there. So that's kind of what we talked about the last couple of days. Before we go ahead and get started, I'll pause to see if anyone has Any questions or thoughts?
Brother NASA. All right, so one of the things I'm wondering about is, hold on. One of the things I'm wondering about is like about turnover. I've I've heard about like what exactly does that mean, and where does that apply like when doing projects?
Yeah, so turnover is basically turning your project deliverables over to your customer. So now you've produced what your customer is expecting. They checked it, they tested it, they signed off on it. You're turning it over to them so they can start using it, and now they take full ownership of it from your project team.
Oh yeah, I was kind of like, so yeah, like since for the teen job fair, we're doing this for the Islamic Leadership Institute, right? That's kind of like what we're doing here. The Islamic Leadership Institute is like the customer that we're, doing like the turnover, because the teen job fair is like the deliverable, the end result, right?
That's correct, right?
Yeah, and that's all after we do like the charter, which is like this document that, you know, talks about, that's like proposing this whole project.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Okay. All right, great. Any other questions? So I see Alawi put in the chat the link for this form. Please make sure you complete it, because I don't think we have everyone's street address, so that's important so we can send you your certificates in the mail. And there's some other information that we just might need to stay in touch. All right, if you're having difficulty filling that out, just let Alawi or myself know. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started with today's overview. So our online job fair continues to be our project of the day. The goal is by the end of the day, you have a full-fledged project plan. Each team should be able to come, just like Abdul was mentioning, hypothetically speaking, you can consider me to be the sponsor of this. So you can come back and say, all right, this is the plan we've come up with for this project. And we want to know how much it's going to cost. How long would it take to get, to this job fair, to make it real? What resources do you need? What types of people do you need to hire? What materials and supplies and things you need to purchase, all that kind of stuff. So it's think of it as a real plan, just like he alluded to or shared. So that's the goal for today. You'll have ample time in the afternoon to work on it together, but your objective should be to make it as real as possible. Technically speaking, if someone would to take your plan, they could actually go ahead and make this real. All right, so today we'll start with risk management. As we know, projects have risk, and it's important to control that risk. One way of controlling it is to plan for it. So you come up with a plan. When we say plan, it's basically the basis of how you're going to do things. How are you going to manage your risk? What are you going to consider to be a risk? So it includes things that, define different components on your project. In this case, it's risk. So what is a risk? How would we deal with certain levels of risk? What are our thresholds? Those kinds of pieces of information. So as you can see under the planning process group, there's about 5 processes. The first one, which is plan risk management, basically a document that explains the approach, what is a risk, all these things we just mentioned. The second process is called identify risks. How are you going to identify a risk? And we'll talk about that a little bit. But typically what people do is they sit down in a room, they brainstorm with sticky notes, what could go wrong? So they come up with what if scenarios. And, they highlight the output of these what if scenarios, and those becomes your risk. So a risk in general is an event that has a probability of occurrence. And if it does occur, it would have some negative impact on your project. All right. The next thing is to do qualitative risk analysis. So once you identify those risks, you start to qualify them. Is it high, medium, low? Just, at a qualitative level without doing any measurements. And then you can also quantitatively measure these risks, and I'll show you an example how to do that in your project planning time. If you can actually put together a risk chart like the one we're going to go over today, that would be really awesome, because that would give you that validation that you really understood the concept of risk management. Once you do that, then you can start working on responses. Responses are basically action items, but a little more than just an action item. It's a mini plan, if you will. So for risk number one, this is what we will do. It's a step of things to do. Again, some definitions. What is in that particular type of risk important and what's not. So that's the planning, processes. When it comes to executing, you will implement some of these risk responses if they occur or you feel they are about to occur. And then lastly, you need to monitor these risks across the life cycle of the project so that you can control them, because you really don't want them to happen. And on good projects, healthy projects, you will see that your risk levels start to decrease as you do more work. All right, so from a risk management perspective, like we just shared, it involves planning. It involves identifying those risks, qualitatively assessing them, and then quantitatively giving them some number to rank them so that you can rank them accordingly and focus on what really matters. And then lastly, you respond to those risks. So how do you identify risks? Like I was just sharing, you come up with what if scenarios, you do assumptions, you analyze your assumptions. Remember back early in the day when you wrote your charter and your scope statement, you had some assumptions to come up with those statements. You're going to go throughout the project and continue to validate these assumptions. Are they still valid? If you feel still that they're valid, then your levels of risk are contained. But if the assumptions change, you need to go back to your plans and update them accordingly. You might have some constraints that you want to, again, update, or diagrams showing certain triggers and things like that. So who weighs on risk identification? It's your subject matter experts. So depending on what you're working on, if it's a crisis line that has technology involved and has processes and people, you would have a subject matter expert who knows about people, about human beings and how they work. You'd have someone who knows about technology, specifically the technology you're using. You would have someone about crisis stabilization and how a crisis center works. So these people would sit in a room together, and every once in a while they review the risk log, and they brainstorm together. You also can do what we call a SWOT analysis. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So the strengths of your project, your weaknesses of the project. These are two things that the project team can control. So examples of strengths of the project is you have a disciplined team. They work, the right number of hours. They work together well. They understand each other. You have a weakness on the team, which is we're missing a key role. We don't have a tester. So the person doing the work is also testing, which, in some cases is not the best, because if there is something that person didn't notice in the first place, chances are they're not going to notice it when they do the testing. So those are examples of strengths and weaknesses on your team. These are things you can control. If you have a missing role, you can control that. You can go and recruit someone. If your team doesn't work well with each other, you can train them, you can coach them and have them, interact more effectively. So these are things that are internal to the project team. The team can control it. The O and the T is opportunities and threats. So these are opportunities that present themselves to the project and the project team that are usually outside the control of the project team. The same with threats. An opportunity could be, for example, that you have a new tax law that came out and it gives incentives to your organization. And now the organization has more cash to invest. So, things are easier on the team. for example, but the team doesn't really control that. Or some other department in the organization didn't do well in the last quarter, sales were low, so the organization doesn't have enough cash around, so they start slashing the budgets of all projects. That's something, again, would be a threat to the project team. They can't control that. That's controlled by the executive team. So SWOT analysis are useful to identify your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats. And from there, you can forecast what could potentially go wrong. Delphi technique is a way where you bring in these same subject matter experts, but instead of having them in one room talking to each other, you're keeping them separate. So they're all in their offices. They're not allowed to talk to each other. You present your project to them, and you ask them independently to provide you input. This way, they're not influencing each other. They're not, paying attention to something someone else said, but they're providing independent thoughts. So you get a more, comprehensive and objective feedback. Interviews is where, you as the project manager, we talked about communication and how engaging with other people on your project is really important. So you can go talk to different people in the organization about what could possibly go wrong in my project. Or, hey, so-and-so, you worked on something similar like this 2 years ago in your department, and now Department B is trying to do the same thing you did. What kind of problems did you have? Having those discussions and interviewing people is really a powerful way to understand risks, because especially there'd be things that are very specific to organizations. Like, oh, we do certain things this way, so watch out for that. Just like anything else on a project, it's iterative. So day one, you're going to come up with 4 or 5 high-level risks, but day 100, they're going to be more detailed, and maybe 4 of those 5 have been closed, and you are presented with another 7 or 8 risks that you just didn't see. So it's an iterative process, and then you're going to select some risks to work on, to manage. You're not going to work on every risk because that becomes very costly. So that's where the evaluation comes in. You prioritize your risks, you put them in a matrix, where you give each risk a probability of occurrence and an impact rating. And if you multiply those two together, you can get a number, and that helps you ranking your risks. So we'll take a look at that. This is what it looks like, a risk impact matrix. Very simple spreadsheet. One dimension talks about the impact. If this risk was to occur, that event was to occur, what would be the impact? It could be low, medium, high. And if, what is the probability of occurrence? So again, the probability could be low, medium, high. And these numbers that you see there would be defined by the project team, depending on the project domain. So some projects are some domains are inherently higher risk than others. And also different organizations are willing to tolerate risk differently. Some organizations are bold and forward thinking, and they don't worry too much. So their thresholds could be very high, where other organizations are very conservative and they would have very low thresholds, especially in areas like financial services, healthcare. Those are typically conservative fields. They're not going to take much risk. When you look at other fields like technology, they were more aggressive in risk taking. So these numbers here, what we're saying is that low is less than 0.02. What does that mean? It means if the impact is 2% or less than 2% to the bottom line, or whatever this risk has to do with, I'll consider it low. So if you are, if we take the example of a crisis line, you say, we're going to upgrade our phone system. And people start asking, okay, what's the impact if something goes wrong? Someone says, oh, it would give us an outage of 10 minutes. All right, what's the percentage of 10 minutes compared to your total, service time? If your service time is 8 hours a day, you can do the math, 10 minutes divided by 8 times 60 and see what that percentage is. If it's less than, in this case, 2%, it's a low impact. If it's, somewhere between 2 and 10%, it's medium. More than 10, it would be red. But someone could say, hey, let's change the 2 to 4 and the 10 to 15. I mean, that's totally fine, again, depending on the organization. And then risk of probability is what's the chance of that risk actually happening. I mean, so a very powerful tool. Typically, you're going to focus only on the red cells, sometimes the orange ones, but the green ones, we're just going to accept those. We're going to accept that this is a low impact, low probability. We're probably not going to bother ourselves too much with it. If it does happen, we'll deal with it at that point. But things that are high, you don't want to do that because obviously it's going to have a significant impact. All right, last thing we'll talk about here with risk is, excuse me, the risk rundown chart. So basically what we're doing here, we're taking a risk, we're breaking it down to the events that can comprise this risk. This is a little more technical, but example here, the risk could be phone lines not working after an upgrade, okay? And the event could be one of these things. These are the triggers. So why would the phones not work? Maybe technician misconfigured the phone number. Number 2 could be there was a typo in the number. Number 3 could be we forgot to enable forwarding. Number 4 could be something else, and so on. And then you assign that risk to someone on your team and you come up with a plan. You say, if that happens, these are the things we will do. Or we will do these things to avoid it from happening. So for example, in the case of the crisis line I just gave, you would say, in order to avoid this risk, if a typo in the number could be a reason, a trigger for the risk, we're going to have 2 people review the phone number as it's entered into the system, prior to launching the new service. So that way you mitigate it, and you mitigate it by a certain percentage. So as you start the activity, your risk is 0% mitigated or retired. You have the full risk could potentially happen. But now we had 2 people review the phone number, it dropped, some percentage, 50%, whatever it is. Now I did step number 2, it dropped even further. I did step number 3, it dropped further until it gets into the green. And at that point, you don't need to worry about your risk anymore. So this is a very powerful tool to track your risk mitigation over time during your project. After you identify it, you prioritize it, and it's red. How do you take it down to the green? Is through a mitigation plan, and you track that plan to ensure that it actually got to that point. All right, so that's risk management. I'll pause here, see if we have questions or thoughts, anything you want to share. You can either unmute yourself and talk or put it in the chat.
Sorry, internet cut out.
All right, any questions? I think you went on mute, Abdul.
So risk management, when we're putting it into our plan book, as well as just when we're putting it into our project workbook, when we get to the risk, the part that deals with risk, one of the things we need to do is as a project manager is to choose different people that knows how to deal with these risks, right? Make assumptions, get special, what did you call it? What did you call that again?
Yeah, that's risk identification. So you're absolutely right. You would go into this tab, for example, and today's date, whatever the date is, you put the date, and you get together with your team. What could go wrong on the job fair, right? So someone could say the main host could lose internet access during the event, right? That's a risk. So you put that here as a description, loss of internet by, host. What's the impact? The impact is going to be high. So you just put high. What's the likelihood of that happening? How do you figure that out, right? What would you guys do to figure out the likelihood of losing the internet during the job fair? So you are the SMEs on the project. What would you guys do to figure that out? Any ideas?
Oh,
This question is for the whole team, not just you. I mean, don't feel pressured to, it's for everyone. So how would you guys find out what's the likelihood? So here's the risk. The description is loss of internet connection during online job fair by host. How can we figure this out?
Maybe call your internet provider to like try to boost up the signal or something.
Boost up which signal?
Like Wi-Fi or something like that. You know,
But nothing, we're not asking how to fix that. We're asking how do you figure out the probability of occurrence, the likelihood? How likely is that to happen?
Ahmed's saying something about like look at historical rates, like historical rates of what, like the internet going out.
Okay, yeah. So your own, who's that host, right? Let's say Alexis was the host, right? Alexis just needs to look at her internet history over the past 120 days. How many times did she lose internet access in the middle of working, right? If it's every day, that's a pretty high occurrence. But if it's once every 6 months, the likelihood would equal to what? Would equal to 1 divided by, let's say, if the unit of time here is a day, 1 divided by roughly, let's say 160, right? So that's the percentage. And if you turn it into 0.63%. So then the team would have to come up with, which is low. So this is here. If we put L here, that's our qualitative measure. That's our qualitative risk analysis. Remember, guys, we said qualitative, then quantitative. So you can, these two columns are qualitative. If you want to do quantitative as well, all you need to do is just add 2 more columns and give them numbers. So impact level and probability of occurrence. So probability we said is 1 divided by, let's say 160 roughly, which is that number.
Brother Nasser. So the way to like figure out the likelihood mathematically is like divide it by 1. Is like divided 1 divided by like whatever the likelihood is, such as like 60, around like
The way to calculate the probability is the number of times something happens over a duration of time, right? So in this case, we're talking about loss of internet. We can hypothetically say that we're going to pick half a year, 6 months as the period of time, or a month. Let's keep it simple, 30 days, a month. How many times does Alexis lose internet per month over the past 6 months? So if her answer is it's once a month, then it would be 1 divided by 30 days. So 1 divided by 30, right? If 1 month she loses internet, the other month she doesn't, the next one she loses once. So it's once every 2 months. So it's going to be half this number, right? So you just figure out the number of occurrence of the event, the risk event, divided by a duration of time, so you can calculate a probability. And that becomes the chances of this thing happening, right? Now, the impact level we said is high. How do we quantify that? So in this case, if the internet is cut off, we go back, just like someone said here, historical rates. When it does cut off once a month, what's the impact? Is it off for an hour or an entire day, or is it off for just a second? If it's off for a second, the impact is relatively low, right? You just click again your mouse, you get a refresh, you join Zoom again, and people are back there. But if it's off for 6 hours and your job fair is 2 hours, you're done, right? Your event is canceled. So depending on, again, historical occurrence. So the impact level could be high. We're gonna say it's 80%. Because if I do lose the internet, I won't be able to connect again for the next 2 hours, and that chances are the program is done. So what you do then here, you multiply these two, this number by that number, you get some other number here. It's not going to be a percentage. It's just, you know, it's better to make these decimals. It's easier. So this would be 0.33. Oops, I need to change these to regular numbers. All right, so 0.8 times this gives you a number here. So this times that is basically your severity, your risk level, 26 points. You know, that's just a number here. And similarly, you do it for everyone else, and then you can start ranking.
Okay, so like impact level, you figure out the impact level by like, you know, wait, what exactly is like, okay, impact level is supposed to be, figure that out like, what was it again?
How bad would things be if your risk trigger occurs? How bad would it be?
And like how you figure that out mathematically,
right?
Is like,
it depends on the nature of the risk, right? So depending on the nature of the risk, you'll have to figure that out. As we said in the example in the slide, this group might say it's 80% impact. Another group might say it's only 0.1 impact, it's 10%. It's very, you know, it's going to differ from one scenario to another, one organization to another. The point is you have two ways to quantify, to assess your risks. One is qualitative, these two columns, D and E. One is quantitative, F and G. And if you do quantitative, you can actually rank them. Most people on most projects just do D and E. Large projects that are very expensive, they do F, G, and H. But you'll find most projects just focus on qualitative measures. All right, let's move on unless there's another question. Anyone else has any other questions? All right, so what you guys are going to do now, we're going to take an activity break. So get together, go back to your workbooks from yesterday. You should have those URLs. I don't have them, but your team leads should have them. Go ahead and start working on risk identification for your project. So start populating 4 or 5 risks here on this tab. Start putting some impacts and likelihoods, you know, high, medium, low. Let's start with that. If you really, you know, got time, you can go ahead and do this other one, but bare minimum, you want to have the impact and likelihood and the description populated. You want to give it an owner and then 2-3 points to mitigate each one of those risks. All right, so we're going to continue our project for the crisis line. We'll give you guys about 10 minutes till 10:45 to finish this up. All right, so we'll join our groups here.